It's a microcosm, isn't it? Second, I always start my talks by talking about my sons. I have two sons, Henry and Charlie. They're 6 and 8 years old. And my son Henry, my older son, this morning asked me. They have a snow day, and I think they were hoping I would have a snow day as well, but of course I don't. Thanks to everyone here. No, I'm just joking. And my older son Henry asked me, "What are you going to do at this place?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to talk about the Middle East." And he said, "The Middle East is boring." And I said, "No." I said, "Trust me." I said, the Israelis wish the Middle East were boring. So I'm going to tell you guys why the Middle East is not boring. I'm going to give you the broad contours of this issue, Iran's support for terrorism, and then my colleagues here on the panel who know a lot more about this than I do will give you maybe more of the detail, let's say. First of all, I want to talk about the strategic purpose behind Iran's support for terrorism. And I don't say this to somehow excuse what Iran is doing. I want you to understand how this plays a role in Iran's broader strategy. Because it's important to me that you understand that you can't divorce this terrorism issue from the nuclear issue as though Iran is leading a double life or something like that. It's all part of a strategy. And why do they do things like pursue nuclear weapons, support terrorism? This is a conventionally weak state that has, instead of pursuing a security strategy focused either on sort of conventional military strength, which it lacks and will always pale in comparison to its potential adversaries, like Israel or the United States, and instead of pursuing, say, peace with its neighbors or economic ties with its neighbors, it is pursuing asymmetric capabilities that are relatively low cost, but can, from their point of view, deter potential enemies. And I think when it comes to this terrorism issue, you have to separate it into sort of two streams. One is the terrorism within the Middle East, so support for groups in Iraq, support for the Syrian regime, even some of their support for Hezbollah within the Lebanese context, and support for Palestinian militant groups. This has a particular purpose and is the responsibility of a certain group of the Quds Force. And the purpose here is to make sure that unfriendly governments, unfriendly to Iran, are destabilized and they're kept occupied internally on the home front, and to encourage the rise of governments which are friendly to Iran. So in Iraq, for example, supporting Shia militants is not a standalone policy, but it's part of an effort to ensure a friendly government in Iraq and the withdrawal of U.S. troops, which has already happened. You can say the same thing perhaps for their support for the Taliban. On the other hand, you have support for terrorism outside the region, which has a different purpose in mind. And that purpose is to target Western interests, to target Israeli interests as part of an effort to deter us, to deter Israel, and to respond to what they see as attacks on them. So if a scientist is killed in Iran, the Iranian doctrine has tended to be to try to respond tit for tat against the West. And so you have essentially these two separate streams of terrorism, because I'm not going to really talk very much about the regional part of this, what's happening in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Yemen, Bahrain, and I think that list gives you a sense of why I'm not going to talk about it, because it's a very large topic of its own. I want to focus instead on the terrorism outside the region, and there's also quite a bit of that. And again, what I want you to understand is that the line between ideology and strategy is perhaps a blurry line often, in Iran's case in particular. But I would say this is primarily, Iran is doing this for sort of reasons that are cold and calculated. They're willing to support groups that are Sunni extremist groups, for example. One of the things we've seen is support from Iran for the Taliban, which is traditionally an enemy of Iran. Support for various al-Qaeda groups, again, enemies of Iran, as well as the support for the Shia militants. So you see that Iran has this kind of calculating purpose in what it's doing that transcends the ideological concerns about, say, combating Sunni extremism or protecting Shiites and so forth. So outside the region, Iranian terrorism is a strategic partnership between the Quds Force and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, originated as a department of the Quds Force, as a proxy of Iran. I would say that Hezbollah has matured into something more than that. Hezbollah is now more of not an equal partner with the Iranians, because they depend on Iran for their funding. but they're a political force in Lebanon, they're a political force and a military force in the region, and it's much more of a partnership these days as opposed to a command and control type of relationship, I would say. And you see that where Iran and Hezbollah are directing their activities tends to have a purpose in mind. So you don't see, for example, a lot of Iranian and Hezbollah activity directed against Russia or China, because there's a hierarchy of interests here. This is directed against those they see as potential enemies, and not directed against those they see, for the most part, as potential friends. But in that hierarchy of interests, taking us on, or taking Israelis on, is maybe more important than avoiding offending their friends. I think you can see this, for example, with the unsuccessful terrorist attack by the Quds Force in India. India is a country with which Iran hopes to have not only commercial but strategic relations, and yet they were willing to conduct a terrorist attack on Indian soil, knowing full well that India is very sensitive to the whole issue of terrorism because of the terrorism that's been directed at India, for example, the Mumbai attacks in New Delhi, and so forth. So sometimes this interest can override those other interests. But since 1996, it's important to observe, since the Khobar Towers attack, there haven't been many sort of spectacular successes for Iranian and Hezbollah terrorism outside of the Middle East. Why is that? I think that it's because in a lot of this, I should say, for those of you who are interested in kind of a deeper dive into this, my colleague Matt Levin has written a book about this. I think he was actually talking about his book earlier, and he's my sort of main source for all this. Hezbollah and the Quds Force, I think, drew back a bit after September 11, 2001, because they were worried about getting caught in the crosshairs of the U.S. counterterrorism effort. And so you didn't see much bold activity outside the Middle East by either of these groups. And look, for better or worse, you might say for worse, this was successful to a large degree, because all throughout the 2000s, when we were targeting al-Qaeda, talking about al-Qaeda, one of my frustrations as a policymaker was that Hezbollah, which prior to al-Qaeda was responsible for more American deaths than any other terrorist group, largely got off scot-free. We didn't do much to target Hezbollah, to push back on Hezbollah, and the Europeans did nothing, literally nothing, to push back on Hezbollah, despite this new focus on terrorism and the global war on terror. So Hezbollah and the Quds Force largely stayed out of our crosshairs. This changed in 2008. In 2008, you had the death of Imad Bugnia, who is the head of Hezbollah's so-called military wing, the Islamic Jihad Organization, or IJO. And with the death of Bugnia, you had a few things happen. You had, number one, a change in personnel at the top, and the people who came in to fill in for Bugnia were more subservient, I would say, to Iran and less independent. Bugnia perhaps was more, because of his stature, more willing to act independently of Iran. Number two, you saw this desire for revenge for the death of Bugnia. And number three, you saw Iran wanting to deter an Israeli or U.S. attack on Iran on its nuclear program, because around the same time, the threat of attack was really ramping up in 2008. So what happened? Well, first of all, not much happened, because what we saw was that Hezbollah ended up being constrained by a lack of resources and by a lack of operational capabilities because of that long absence they had from engaging in this type of activity. And so, initially, you had Hezbollah having to turn to what we would call permissive environments. They found that in the post-9/11 world, a lot of the targets that they would have liked to have attacked were hardened. Our counterterrorism policies were coming into play. And so they turned to permissive environments like Azerbaijan, Egypt, Turkey. But even there, they had spectacular failures. They had botched plots in 2008, 2009. And so what we saw was that the Quds Force and Hezbollah together made this decision to, number one, try to invest in the revitalization of Hezbollah's military capabilities, its expeditionary military capabilities. And number two, quite importantly for this discussion, to start taking on some of the terrorism responsibilities themselves, directly, the Quds Force, which they hadn't wanted to do outside the region before. They didn't like to get their hands dirty in this way, for the most part, since maybe the 1980s. But now they were going to take on more specifically, and they created a new unit, Unit 400, of the Quds Force to do this. So in January 2010, you have this personnel shakeup, and you have an investment now in new capabilities for Hezbollah. And their plan was three-tiered. Their targeting plan was three-tiered. Israeli tourists, Israeli officials, and then Western interests. And the way they divided up the labor was Hezbollah was responsible for the first two, Israel, and the Quds Force directly would take on the targeting of Western interests. But again, what we saw then afterwards was a series largely of bungled plots. And I think you guys are familiar with some of these. Maybe my colleagues will talk in more detail about some of them. We saw bungled plots in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, in India, in Thailand, in Georgia, and so forth. And again, why these places, people ask? Is it because suddenly there's sort of deep penetration in these places or a priority placed on Thailand and Georgia? No, I think not for the most part. It's because these are permissive environments for the Iranians. They look at the hardened targets, those are more difficult to attack, and so they look for targets which are softer. Israeli diplomats outside of Israel, in environments which are less secure, perhaps. There were, however, some notable successes. There was, of course, the Burgas attack in Bulgaria. There was the assassination of a Saudi diplomat in, I believe, Pakistan. But for the most part, these plots were not successful, and I think the most notable, most famous example of these bungled plots was the plot to kill the Saudi ambassador right here in this city, in Washington, D.C., using this used car salesman from Texas, a man by the name of Arbab, which I think stunned a lot of people. In fact, wasn't believed by a lot of people because of just the absolute sloppiness of it. And that's, I think, what this revealed to us as we looked at this series of bungled plots, that you had poor tradecraft from the Quds Force, contrary to their reputation for being very professional, and simply incompetence from the Quds Force. Now, Matt Levitt, as I said, my colleague, attributes this in part to sort of these rapid promotions within the Quds Force of mediocre sort of managers who were overseeing this effort. But I think there was also more to it. You saw also poor coordination and deconfliction between Hezbollah and the Quds Force. You saw that Hezbollah and the Quds Force would both be plotting attacks in the same city at the same time, but weren't necessarily aware of what one another were doing. We saw a certain amount of desperation and a desire for speed to kind of get plots moving quickly to have a big impact on U.S. calculations or Israeli calculations, likely because of what was happening on the nuclear front. And so that brings us, in a sense, to where we are today. We've seen, again, these Quds Force efforts to directly engage in terrorism, but a shocking lack of competence and tradecraft in doing so. A welcome, frankly, lack of tradecraft and competence in doing so. And so the question is, I mean, should we therefore rest easy? And should we say, well, okay, now we don't need to worry about this because these guys are amateurish now? Well, I think that would be dangerous. Because what did we see? As I said, we saw desperation, but desperation, I think, is dangerous. Because even though Iran didn't show a great deal of competence in pursuing these plots, what they showed was they showed a determination and a willingness to take risks and even to partner with unnatural allies. So, for example, in Kenya, where there was a sort of budding Africa-related plot revealed, which maybe Nir will go into more, you saw this kind of cooperation, at least nascently, with the Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And that's quite something for Iran to do that, given their own feelings about Al-Qaeda. You saw also a ability by the Quds Force, even if very poorly, to act globally, to put agents in foreign capitals and so forth. And I think the worry now is that this determination, this willingness to act globally sort of far afield in places like Thailand and Georgia, combined with this investment in new capabilities, which may at some point pay off, because let's face it, Hezbollah has shown and the Quds Force have shown incompetence on this front, but when it comes to, for example, their activities in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, they do show a great deal of competence and professionalism, which suggests that maybe that will then be extended to these external activities. There's a lot of reason for worry here. And so I think that what we mostly need to do, and I'm going to end my brief part of this discussion here, is not only to remain vigilant. I think that goes without saying. And I have a lot of confidence in both U.S. counterterrorism officials and in Israeli counterterrorism officials that they'll do that. But I think that we also need to take, for example, things like this Burgas plot, things like the plot against the Saudi ambassador, together with our sort of new willingness over the past decade to take counterterrorism seriously and the new counterterrorism tools we have, to make sure that we do address the threat coming not just from Sunni extremist groups, not just from Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, but from Hezbollah and from the Quds Force and its activities, which, remember, prior to 9/11, this was the big terrorist threat. and we shouldn't discount the fact that it could be again. I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much.